Hey, everybody, this is Chuck Marone. Welcome back to the Strong Towns podcast. Beth Osborne is a frequent guest on our show. I think this is like three or four, or five. I don't remember how many times. She is the director at Transportation for America. I'm going to say this, one of my favorite people, particularly when
Oh,
it comes to policy. Beth, you are wonderful. I really have enjoyed getting to know you and talking to you. And by the way, Beth has forgotten more about transportation policy than I know. So I want to have her on and talk a little bit about the Highway Trust Fund. Beth, welcome back to the Strong Towns podcast.
thanks so much for what an incredible introduction. I can tell you
Oh,
one thing I have not forgotten is the first time I met you when I was working at the U.S. Department of Transportation and I stumbled
uh-oh.
upon Strong Towns and I read your stuff and I turned to my colleagues and said, we have to get this guy over here. And we invited you over to talk to folks at Federal Highways. I was hoping you could shake some sense into them.
Did that
We,
go okay? I mean,
you were great. You're always great.
okay, good. I'm glad. Well, I'm not always great. And
Yeah, you're pretty good.
sometimes I get a little cranky when I'm talking to engineers. So I
Oh,
hope I wasn't too cranky.
join the club.
Well, I was just talking to someone today in the office about like there was someone here to interview me today. It was supposed to go an hour and it went 2.5. But one of the things they
Wow.
asked me was about like my personal transformation. And I had to say, like, I used to be really cranky about all this stuff. Like I felt like no one was listening.
Hmm?
And it actually took like building this movement of people who are interested in this and finding people like you who I think were thinking about it in similar ways that made me feel less alone. But when you said that, like I remember the first time we met, I'm like, oh, was I cranky? Because I remember being my angry phase.
I'm very sympathetic to the feeling. I often feel that way myself. And somehow I was told when I was younger that I would mellow as I aged, but I'm understanding the track to cranky old lady because I don't have infinite time to change things. And yet
Yeah.
I watch people fall into the same holes, make the same mistakes repeatedly, admit that something went wrong, and yet learn nothing from it over and over. And watching the cycle repeat itself is really disheartening. And I think that leads to that crankiness where you lose patience with the people you're talking to because how can they not see the pattern that you see? So
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
sympathetic.
Um, well, along those lines, let's talk about the Highway Trust Fund because
Okay.
if there's one thing that we've done consistently well in this country, it is this glorious thing called the Highway Trust Fund. Um, can you eh, can you give us a little bit of the background of where this thing came from
Mhm.
and kind of what the original intent was? Because I think that will set the stage for the other conversations we need to have. But I think people need to understand what this is.
Absolutely. I'm going to start with the creation of the Federal Trust Fund, which was
Mhm.
as part of the Federal Highway Act in the 1950s. But it actually goes way before that. And if you go to Eno's site and read Jeff Davis's work, he wrote a wonderful history of the gas tax that shows how it was created at the state level and why and how it grew. Um, Basically under Eisenhower, when he was general, he saw the benefit of having an Autobahn in Germany and wanted to see something like that in the US. He had envisioned it as a way to move military vehicles to protect the United States and military supplies to protect the United States from invasion by ocean. Not necessarily to move people, but it was meant to move people and goods over longer distances to connect cities to one another. And if you go to his library, you'll see a lot of consternation about the way the trust fund was used to build the interstate system. But the general idea was to have funding paid for by the user to build and maintain the thing that is being built for their benefit. Initially, it was just to build it. I don't think the creators recognize that it would go on as long as it has. But once you have a funding stream, it's hard to go away from it. And in the early 1990s, uh, they started talking about fully protecting that funding. It was actually when I started on Capitol Hill that they did it, that they guaranteed that every penny that went into the trust fund would be protected from the annual spending process and only go to cover the authorized programs for highways and transit. And transit was added in as part of a negotiation to raise the tax in 1982 under Ronald Reagan. So the benefit of it is you have guaranteed funding beyond next year. You don't have to justify your spending on an annual basis, which can be important when you're building large projects that need a guarantee of multi-years of funding. However, it is important to point out that we are unusual. Most every state, most every country in the world, including countries with significantly better infrastructure, do not have a trust fund. So while people love it, especially those that want the reliance on funding to spend. It is not required to do things well, and other countries that don't have a trust fund do things better.
Yeah. Can I drill it down on two things? The
Sure.
first one, you said that this was created to fund the creation of the interstate highway system. Are we done with that? Like we, I think there's this question of like, when did we finish that? And I actually hear people argue like, well, we're not done, or we did.
Yeah.
What if you were Eisenhower and you were looking now at this creation? At what point would you kind of put your finger on the timeline and say that that's like when we were done, or what's the nuance around that?
Well, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan from New York actually declared the system completed as part of a bill, the the acronym for which is ICE-T. I won't even bother to go into what
I
it stands for.
remember
It doesn't matter.
there was I remember that. I remember Ice T. It was
Interstate
sweet.
surface,
Yeah.
intermodal surface transportation, blah, blah, blah,
Uh-huh.
blah. Anyway,
Enhancement
uh,
Act.
something like that. Yes.
Yep. Okay.
And and part of it was declaring that we had completed the original vision. But there are a lot of folks that don't like that notion. They want to add on to it when as cities sprawl outwards, they want to better connect them as cities spring up that used to be much smaller. They want to connect them in, and it's good business to keep building it. Plus, the desire to widen is ever present because we don't want to admit that there is no way to avoid congestion, especially in a good economy and when everyone's trying to do the same thing at the same time. And we have also expanded its mandate to really just include all of what they call federal aid highways, which used to have a deeper meaning. It was the more significant highways. It then became every state-owned rural route, and then the city said, well, that just means no money ever comes into the city. So it became every state-owned or major arterial in a city. And so it just expanded, and it now has kind of infinite use, and therefore it's harder to declare anything about it at an end. I'd also argue I would love to see the mandate turn more into a systems engineer and industrial engineering problem where we're looking at the system and we are maintaining it and making it more efficient without adding to its footprint. But that is, it's very much a civil engineering program. So it's still looking at building that next increment.
So a lot of people believe, and I feel like this is changing, but certainly, if we went back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, most people believe that when they pay their gas tax, when they get gas, fill their car with gas, that is covering the roads that they drive. And
Yes.
let's say that broadly, but I think we can acknowledge just between the two of us, like very quickly, it's not paying for most of your local streets. It's not paying for your cul-de-sac. It's not paying for that. But most people believe that like the highways that I'm driving are being paid by the federal gas tax. The interstates are being paid by the federal gas tax. All these bridges are paid by the federal gas tax. And so what's the problem? We're paying for this. We should get it. it is it true that our gas tax is paying for this stuff?
So it is paying for it. It is not paying fully for it. The federal gas tax is very small. It's 18.4 cents per gallon. It's a little bit more, 24.4 cents per gallon on diesel. And there are other funding streams that are relatively minor, like on tires and things like that, that also pay into the trust fund. But it's been frozen since 1993 when there was a big budget deal to balance the budget under President Clinton, and the gas tax was part of that budget balancing exercise. If people can remember back to a day where
I was
balancing
going
the
to
budget
say,
was a
what are you,
possibility.
what are you talking about? Like, I've never, this is such a
Crazy.
weird concept. I
Oh,
don't know what you mean.
and we were close to paying down the debt, and it's just now it's decades in the past.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Those were the, those were the good old days, right?
so it's a small amount of the overall spending. Your state gas tax is a much bigger part of what pays for the roadways, and that varies any place from my home state, where I think the gas tax is in the low 30 cents, like 33, 34 cents per gallon, all the way up to a Washington state, which I think now is over 60 cents or something like that. It's much, much more expensive. And so that covers the overwhelming cost. I mean, if you're bringing in 60 cents per gallon, in a state like Washington by yourself, and then the feds are only giving you a piece of the nationwide 18 cents. I mean, obviously that's a small minority, but even all of that does not pay for all of our roadways. Two things to consider. One is a lot of those local roadways are covered by local property taxes, sales taxes, things like that. And we have a massive national backlog in our maintenance. Nothing that pays for itself can have a backlog. You don't have a backlog when you're paying your way. So we admit in the same breath over and over that we're not paying for ourselves while claiming that the trust fund is a process for the user to pay for itself. So there's a cognitive dissonance there, that we have not come to grips with in my career.
I want to ask a nuanced question because it seems like I looked, Minnesota is my state is 28 and a half cents is the state tax. Federal is 18.4. It does seem like over time, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the state went from being a smaller portion to now a much larger portion. Is that kind of reflective of the maintenance burden that states take on with this? And
Yes.
I, what I see a lot of is the federal government being very helpful when it comes to building new things, and maybe a little bit less helpful when it comes to maintaining existing systems. How has this kind of interacted with where that burden has shifted over time and what we're actually paying for?
Yeah, and actually, if I must have remembered it wrong, Louisiana's down in the 20-cent level, because I know Louisiana is one of the lowest in the country, and maybe Washington's more like 50 cents. But yeah, still way more than the federal program. And I think it really has to do with the fact that the feds can't get their act together to keep up with inflation. So the states have just taken on the burden because somebody has to pay for the increasing need. The how far 18.4 cents went in 1993 versus today is, it's not comparable. So on a really, it didn't matter the size of the state, the region, the politics, they've all pulled together and raised the state gas taxes to keep up with need, at least to a greater sense than the feds. I think my home state is amongst the worst in that respect.
What is
Um,
your home state? I can't remember.
Louisiana.
Louisiana, you're 20 cents a gallon is what
It's
it,
it's
yeah.
pitiful. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
absolutely pitiful. And yet they're expanding roadways and building new things while other things are falling apart. And
Yes.
they've spent a ton of time saying, well, we shouldn't pay for a lot of these lighting using the gas tax. That's somebody else's problems. The locals can take care of the lighting. We shouldn't pay for the police to patrol it. We shouldn't pay for maintenance needs, and just trying to push things out rather than just say what it costs to own and operate a
Right.
roadway system. So very, very little responsibility there. But yeah, I think that they've just, most states have realized that they can't wait on the feds. They're more trusted than the federal level anyway, though I think that is slipping. So people are more likely to raise taxes locally, and it gives them more control of over how to spend their money than waiting for it to come through the federal government. You asked a second part of that question, and I went
I,
far
I
afield. I
asked
can't
about
remember.
kind of this relationship between where the maintenance burden is shifting and what because a lot of what I see is the federal government using their money
To
almost
build the
as an
new things.
inducement to build new stuff. And the states kind of accessing that money by building new things. And I'll even go a step further. I know, in the departments of transportation that I've spoken with, they'll say, well, here's our list of priorities. And we're putting maintenance first, or we're putting a greater emphasis on maintenance. But then the enticement comes in to bump up the thing that's maybe 30th on the list up to number one, because the federal government will pay a larger percentage of it. And so it's maybe not our priority, but we can build this new thing today because we can get money from the feds to do it. Am I
Yeah.
over exaggerating? Is that
No, I think it might be you started by saying a nuanced question. I think it is a quite nuanced answer, which is on one hand, the federal funds are so small that they're often not as useful to build big new things. Even if you can get 80% federal funding and only have to match it with 20% local, if you're a state like Texas that has tons of state dollars and comparatively little federal, you might you might not worry about the 20%. You're just trying to get the money to work out. Um, I think that the impetus to build new comes from the fact that we still believe that that is modernizing, that is part of showing growth, and we are still promising something we can't, which is a congestion-free trip whenever you want to travel, wherever you want to travel, where we want to guarantee that no matter how far you need to go, it will be easy and convenient. So we need those speeds to be high, especially as we put your destinations further and further away. At the federal level, though, there's another message that comes across, which is we're going to draw the line at building things, and then it will be on you at the state and local level to operate and maintain. I don't love that line. I think if the feds were responsible for maintenance, they wouldn't be as excited about building new things. And that line that they'll help you build and the states and locals will maintain hasn't ever worked. We've just added to the definition of maintenance. And so we need to be a partner in being responsible for anything at the federal level we participate in building. The day we do that, we will be more circumspect about what gets built.
wouldn't that mean, though, a very large increase in the federal gas tax? I mean, we already have these huge backlogs. We're not able to take care of all the needs that we have. We haven't, as you said, raised the gas tax since the early 1990s. Why are we not having a serious conversation about raising the federal gas tax? Why is that not kind of on the table? And I'll even go a step further. Why, when we do these authorizations, is it rely on, I'm going to use the word kind of gimmicky money, but
Yep,
either like deficit spending, or we're going to take money from Fannie and Freddie's profits over the last 5 years and move that around.
yep.
Why are we not, if we've got a dedicated trust fund that's supposed to fund our needs, why are we not funding that trust fund? Like, what's kind of the policy problem there?
Yeah. And I would say we either need to increase the gas tax and pay our way, or admit we don't want to and cut the program, or at least and be much more choosy on what we spend our money on. Right now, we're trying to have it both ways. Um, why have we not raised the gas tax? Ugh, so this is where having a longer career helps you to see these patterns that turn you into a cranky old lady. Um, So when I first started on Capitol Hill in the 90s, we were bringing in more money than we needed. So every time we brought up the surface transportation program for authorization, we were trying to figure out how to share the new pot of funds. That's one of the reasons it is a firmly bipartisan program. Is it's very easy to be bipartisan and have everyone get along when your biggest problem is how to spread the extra profits. Um, and then in 2005, when we passed what was then known as safety, um, Congress knew that the gravy train was running dry, and they actually set up that authorization to have the program run into financial straits as it came to an end in order to force that future Congress, which would be 2 to 3 Congresses away, to do something about it, to finally be brave and raise the gas tax. We're not brave enough, but we're going to create pressure on that next
We're going to
Congress
run
to
this
do it.
thing into the ditch and make a
We're going
big
to
dumpster fire out of it. So you have to actually have to solve it.
absolutely
Yeah.
correct.
That's
And it's beautiful politics, right?
great governance. Yeah.
And it didn't work. In each case, they came up with gimmicks. And then in the most recent one, the bipartisan infrastructure law, they just deficit spent and made this part of a big recovery bill, much like the Recovery Act in 2009. So they kind of got out of paying for it. And now we're set up to have a big cliff. But the fact of the matter is, after decades of convincing the country that any tax at the federal level is inherently evil. I don't know how they ever raise a tax on almost anything, much less
Right.
a gas tax. A gas tax is unpopular when fuel prices are high, because there's a belief that it will make the fuel prices go higher. That's not how it works. The market sets the price, and the gas tax gets taken out of that price, maybe around the margins. And then when the gas taxes are low, no one wants to make them higher, so it's never popular. It's always the feds are a little too far away from the individual driver for them to believe it will benefit them directly. So it allows the states to kind of boogeyman the feds, and Congress, it doesn't love doing it anyway. And so there's no impetus to do so, except for nobody wants to cut the program, and they've always figured out a way out of it. I don't know if they'll be able to do it this time. This program is huge. This program is
Yeah.
way bigger than it has been. The gas tax does not come close to covering its needs. It should not be a trust fund anymore. It does not follow the trust fund rules. For it to be a trust fund, I believe 80% of its uh, income has to come from a user fee. It doesn't come close. And so someone should bring up a point of order and kill the trust fund, but no one wants to do that either.
Let me ask you about the last authorization then, because that was part of that 2021 infrastructure bill. And maybe before we get too deep into this, I'm just going to emphasize bipartisan infrastructure bill, because I think obviously there's a lot of politics around this and how this stuff gets spent, but there's been a general consensus, I guess, to kind of extend and pretend, or like make this work. This is not a Republican thing. It's not a Democrat thing. It's kind of been a bipartisan consensus to do this. So with that, with people not, because we're in a political season and people freak out about, well, this was the crowning achievement of the Biden administration or whatever. There's a lot of sausage made when we do these reauthorizations. What was some of that with this one that allowed
Mhm.
us to uh, kind of stop having infrastructure week and have like a bill? Like what made it work this time? And
Yeah,
I'm going to ask you at the end, is that repeatable? So
yeah, yeah.
go for it.
Okay. Much like in 2008 with the housing crisis, there was an opportunity to goose the economy,
Opportunity
preferably.
in air quotes, right?
Preferably with real improvements. The notion was, if you go back to the Great Depression, some of the things that had the greatest stimulus effect were the things that not only created jobs, but the things that created permanent improvements. And infrastructure is always a good place to go there. And you can define infrastructure in terms of your roadways and transit, but it can also be housing, or affordable housing, pipes, things like that. But those are things that have a long-term impact on communities. It's not just like we're paying people to dig ditches and fill them in again, though there was some of that during the Great Depression as well. And so it was that concept that was brought to bear with the Recovery Act in 2009. And it was the same thought coming out of COVID with what is known as the IIJA, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. And it was that moment of, we don't want the economy to totally stall out. We want to push through, um, and pull us out of this, worldwide pandemic. And our economy did much better than most of our international neighbors. You could say it was because of this. You could say it was never going to go down as far as people feared. But that was the thought process behind it. And that is why I don't think it's repeatable, because, I mean, dear heavens, I hope we're not headed into another worldwide health and or economic catastrophe. It certainly does not appear that way. And it takes something like that to create a rescue bill environment where something like this can be done. So I don't think it is repeatable. And with it not being repeatable, and I think the concept of raising the gas tax or raising taxes from the highway user at all is toxic. It that sets up quite a crisis situation. Either you've got a deficit spent or you've got to cut the program.
The program expires, the current authorization, in 2026.
September
What I
30th.
hear you what I hear you saying is that we've got 2 years to either have some kind of massive crisis economically that we can put, a reauthorization under the umbrella of, or we have to come to grips with the idea that the trust fund is just broken, is a
Yep.
broken model. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, we can argue about the 2 years. I mean, we've never reauthorized on time ever.
Mm. Yeah,
So, the chance that it would go, they'd extend it and come up with some way to add funding to keep it alive for another year so they could come back to it after an election. Remember, September 30th of 2026 is right before congressional elections. We're not doing
sure.
it then. So,
Right,
yeah,
right.
but the point is, for the crisis is going to be that at every expiration, this first one that will happen in 2026, they have to come up with money to keep the program whole into throughout the extension. Maybe they do one for 6 months or a year. If they can't figure it out, then they're looking at another extension. How many extensions can they do? How what is part of the extension? How about that question to start? Is the huge new rail program part of the program, or are they only extending the highway and transit program? Do they try what was tried in 2010, 2011, someplace around, I think of 2011, when there was an attempt to throw transit out of the trust fund and say, if we don't have these non-highway things in the bill, then we can come close to paying our way with the gas tax as it is, which they won't even be able to do that.
Want to be close
There,
now, right?
yeah, there's all kinds of shenanigans they can try, but I think the point is going to be there's no there's they can't pull a rabbit out of their hat again. They've got to actually grapple with the hard choices now.
Let me say this back to you in a different way and tell me if I'm grasping this. The trust fund creates like X amount of revenue, but we're spending 2x or 3x or whatever that multiple is. In the current bill, the omnibus bill, we came up with ways to fill that gap. Other money from other places, borrowing some money, what have you, stimulus, okay. But now this thing is not going to be tucked in with all this other stuff. It's not going to be, it's going to stand on its own September 30th, 2026. And either it's not going to get reauthorized, which means what, or we're going to have to find, we're either going to have to say we're going to borrow more money, or we're going to
Raise more money.
raise more money somewhere else, or we're going to take
Mhm,
money from this program and move it
mhm.
over, or we're going to do, am I
Yeah,
understanding? Like,
yeah, that's
so
it.
what happens if it doesn't, what happens if we don't do that? What does an extension look like that says we're just going to spend the money in the trust fund? Like that's it.
It means, well, there's a couple ways you could do it. You could just bring every program down by an equal amount, across the board cut sort of thing.
Everybody gets
Um,
2/3 cut to their federal appropriation.
exactly.
Yeah.
You might cut a bunch of the competitive grant programs. The competitive grant programs, by
Which
the
are a
way,
small portion of the overall thing. Yeah.
they are, but they can be quite significant, especially if you're not a state and you don't have any direct access to federal funding. So if you're
Mhm.
a city, you have to go through your state and or metropolitan planning organization, which is often very much dependent on their state. So having that direct point of access to the feds is incredibly valuable, but I would think that would be one of the first things that would get slashed, or you cut programs altogether. So maybe you say that there are, you know, two handfuls of major programs in the federal highway apparatus. And maybe they say, well, we've got two big flexible traditional programs, the National Highway Performance Program, which is about making the highway program work better, and the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, which is an incredibly flexible program. Everything else, like a program to improve safety, the Highway Safety Improvement Program, the CMAC program, which is about air quality improvements, the new resilience program. Let's just get rid of all that. They can handle that if it's appropriate, which will be an important thing the states will say, out of the other two. And all that extra stuff can just go away. We streamline the program, we simplify it, and then us, the taxpayer, cross our fingers that the states actually want to do that with their newfound extra flexibility.
Okay. Let me let me ask this. Okay, I'm gonna say it this way. I'm not like a Washington, D.C. person. I live in a small town in central Minnesota. I have had the good fortune or the kindness or what have you to have some people on congressional staffs, actually some elected officials in Congress, want to talk to me about this stuff. And I got to tell you, like, I'm not a policy person. I'm a bottom up person. I can talk to your mayor. I'm not like advising the president or Congress on what to do on these things. That being said, I have seen and experienced kind of across the aisle consternation over this issue, and a what to me seems like a surprising level of support to end the highway trust fund. And I mean, uh, the word devolution has come into play. And I'm going to say, because I know that that is a 1990s Republican word. I mean, that's a Newt Gingrich kind of word. How do we give block grants to states and how do we send this back? I have heard that word from Democrats in Congress who have said maybe the trust fund has outlived its use and we should actually like end this program and give it back to the states. Can you can you talk a little bit about maybe why they would be thinking that, and why, if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, why you might be open to that in a way that you wouldn't have been maybe 2 decades ago?
Yeah, you said earlier something that I don't think we dig into enough, which is, the bipartisanship of the program. It has very large bipartisan support, and then a small group of bipartisan, not opposition, but frustration.
Yeah.
But it is not based in party. The bipartisanship of the program is a bipartisan and unanimous agreement to jointly spend vast amounts of money to undermine everybody's priorities equally. that is one of the reasons I'm not always a fan of bipartisanship, because if everyone's agreeing, you've either found a unicorn of an issue, which is a unicorn,
Happens sometimes, right?
happens sometimes, but it is rare,
Yep.
or you're all grossly uninformed somehow, which is what's happening here. So in the opposition, you'll find folks, it's a variety of folks. You'll find folks that think the feds just have no business interfering with the way the states invest in transportation. So just get them out of the business. I believe Mike Lee of Utah said, let's just bring it back down to a 4 cent per gallon tax, and that will pay for the interstates. I don't know if that will or won't. It certainly would have much less money to build new interstates or expand interstates. Send that back to the states and tell them everything else, they're on their own. Others have said, the feds make it hard for us to do what we want. We want to expand more roadways and not have to go through regulations like the National Environmental Policy Act, or have to pay the Davis-Bacon fair wages, or not have to worry about the civil rights laws and regulations. We just want to do things as we think is appropriate here. And then there's another side of that, which is the feds are forcing us to build in a one size fits all way, based on the highway capacity manual of the 1950s, and they just really haven't updated things, and so they're distorting our system and what we want to get from it, and their rules and regs are just out of sync. And so that creates a bunch of people trying to do very, very different things for very different reasons, but all of which don't think this program is working for them. Um, I don't know if they'll be big enough to convince Congress to step away from the program or let it shrink. However, it's harder to come up with a coalition to do something hard like raise taxes
Find the
or come
money,
up with or
right? To
find the
close the
money
gap. Yeah.
than it is to mess things up. Sometimes it's easier being a spoiler. So that's going to be what's really interesting to watch here. And at the center is the fact that we don't have a mission for the federal program. We could create one. We could say it is to bring the system, and we'll define it as state highways and interstates, into a state of good repair by it within the next authorization in 6 years. No one can spend anything except on maintenance, for the next 6 years straight. That could be our goal. It could be to have an interstate style investment in transit finally. I mean, but we don't have that clear and defining role. And so the money is just kind of dripping out and doing random things all over the place. And we have that works because everyone sees themselves in the program, but I don't know they see themselves in the program well enough to take the slings and arrows of coming up with new money.
One of the critiques that I have long had that I think rubs some progressives, particularly the wrong way, is the idea that we buy a mile of sidewalk or bike lane with 10 miles of highway expansion.
Absolutely right.
I'm going to say, is that an unfair critique? Because
No.
there's a lot of people who want bike lanes, and I respect that. Like, I get that. There's a lot of people who want the sidewalk improvement, and I'm with you on that. Would ending, I think here's the pushback that I get that is very legitimate. And it's this: would ending the highway trust fund, or allowing the highway trust fund to expire and not be renewed, and having, in a sense, a situation where the states assumed even more role, would that get us closer to building the transportation system that we want? And I hear people saying, and I think there's some credibility here, that it's going to take federal leadership for us to switch from highway expansions to bottom up investment, to shift from building the next highway lane to building an operable transit system. I'm cynical of that because I watch $1 of good project be paid for with $10 of bad project. And I
Yep.
don't know where you fall on that. Can you make the argument one way or the other? I'm not really.
Oof. Ugh,
It's a hard
that's
one, isn't
hard.
it?
It's hard. It is.
Right.
And you're not wrong. I think all the arguments are not wrong and they're not right. So where do you start? I fully agree with you. I feel this way on the highway transit side. For every dollar we want to increase transit, we have to raise $4 to raise highway funding. And there are the number of progressives that think that is totally fair and will actually improve things in terms of their priorities is just flabbergasting to me. The climate activists that will say, so long as I get my transit program, it's okay to go build massive highway expansions that will come out ahead. That's that's not how that the math doesn't work. You'll have
Right.
more emissions from the bad things than the emissions you cut off from the good thing. You're not reaching your goal. But there's this the politics of having lost in the past, a politics of scarcity that I think a lot of the folks focusing on non auto modes are stuck in, and they think
Yeah.
they can only hope for the scraps from the table. So they repeatedly not only accept it, they only ask for the scraps. They fear being kicked out of the room for asking for anything that would actually change communities. And that's become dangerous, in my opinion. I think that's one of the biggest reasons we see our safety numbers going in the wrong direction, and emissions going in the wrong direction. And frankly, the amount people have to drive every year and spend on transportation and spend in their car going in the wrong direction. Everybody is losing. And interestingly, I think the folks that are very focused on moving vehicles are also losing. They just don't feel like it because they're getting to build lots of things. And in this country, we say, we'll let you make promises and build something. And then when it's done, we won't check whether or not it turned out the way you promised. And
Right.
then if it
Right.
goes wrong, that's a reason. If you do a bad job, that's why you should get more money to keep doing the thing that didn't work. So
Sadly.
that's allowed everybody to declare wins within their worlds. Now, if
Mhm.
you cut out the federal program, some places might do better. Some places would be forced to deal with the fact that they're not paying in their own way. And that alone would be fascinating. Maybe my home state of Louisiana would recognize that they can't just be building stuff willy nilly. They have to choose. They need to finally say that I-49 in Shreveport is off the table forever. Maybe they have to say that the I-49 in Lafayette should not happen because it's not a good use of now incredibly scarce dollars. Maybe they finally replace the I-10 bridge in Baton Rouge and they don't expand I-10 and I-12. So it could force people to make real decisions, not just extend project start dates or the length of time it will take to deliver a project. In other states, I think that the feds are one avenue to force them to think about something other than moving cars quickly, and they will do things very poorly. Other states might do things a little bit better. I can't really think of many states that would do things spectacularly well. Maybe Colorado. There's some interesting things going on in your home state, so maybe
Yes.
they would be a bit of a leader there. But it's not a lot of leadership at the state level for change.
You work with a lot of state DOTs though. And I think
I
this is
do.
to me, this is the question because I look at like a state like California, which the rhetoric from California is very
Great,
much,
isn't it?
oh
Very
yeah, I mean
exciting.
like everybody's like excited about it. But then you watch California take their climate money and transfer it into highway dollars.
Hmm.
And you're like, what, how does this rhetoric line up with what you're doing? And I do think it's a fair critique. I would be very happy with ending the federal system and having it become more state because I feel like there's more ability for us to impact and influence state policy and change it. But I also recognize that state policy is also very, very entrenched. And even when you have the rhetoric and the funding for an alternate approach, the state systems will do almost anything they can, even in a state like California, to
Oh, yeah.
turn that money into highway money.
Well, and part of it is just California is huge.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
impacting politics in California is about as hard as impacting politics at the federal level. I mean, it's
Sure.
gigantic state. Um, and then going back to my home state, the desire to punish New Orleans for being New Orleans is strong in the state
Right.
legislature and with a lot of governors. So, and you find that in other states, you'll hear that the big cities in most states feel like the state is coming for them. In Idaho, sometimes you hear people refer to Boise as the state of Ada, for Ada
Yeah.
County. So those politics may not work out so well in urban areas. Minnesota and all some of the Midwestern states are a little different. Have I think a little bit more of a culture of
I feel like we would
cooperation.
figure this out fairly
Yeah,
well, but
like New
I don't know.
York would not.
Good luck. Yeah.
It
No,
just
I hear you.
you go all the way back to the beginning of New York and rereading the Power Broker. It's always been dysfunctional. So I think you'd have very uneven results. At this point, I don't know that that is the wrong way to go. There would be new problems. It would take a lot of work to impact them. I think even the states that can carry the burden themselves would feel a big hit in losing federal dollars. So that would lead to theoretically to some kind of reckoning. But in general, I would like to see I'd like to see a reckoning at the federal level that just causes a big shift. Maybe at the federal level, we're less a profit sharer. We raise the money and we share it, and more of an investor with a focus of plugging holes. We have a program to help do big replacements. Small states, especially, really struggle to replace bridges and things like that. That's just an overwhelmingly big expense for a big state with a small population. So maybe we're more just in the business of those sorts of things, or maybe we're there to help fill gaps in systems. But as more of an investor, where you come and make a case and there's some accountability, I think the just block grant style, especially in an unaccountable system where members of Congress can come and go between votes, is not leading to the good governance that we need.
Wouldn't I'm looking at this and I'm thinking like a state like New York, which I just looked up, has a 25-cent gas tax. If you shifted this from the state to the feds to the state, ostensibly New York could raise 18 cents more a gallon and not impact the overall price that people would pay.
Mhm.
If the federal gas tax went away, then a state like New York is a net like sender of money to other states. If New York was just in their own selfish self-interest, wouldn't they actually have more money by not being part of a federal trust fund, but having this be collected by the state and just spent locally?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's just the way you get to it is you need a legislature full of people that are super excited to be responsible for charging more to their taxpayer and then go
Sure.
before them for reelection. And look, I mean, you spend 50 years convincing everyone that raising taxes is a bad thing. It means it's really hard to raise taxes. And so here we are. No one
That's
wants to do it.
interesting. Even if I cut 18 cents over here and I add 18 cents over here, so we're not increasing
Oh,
anything, it still
so
is like
they're the
two
good
separate
guys, and
votes.
now I'm the
Yeah.
bad guy. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
terrible.
yeah. I hear you.
Now,
Politics is so
at
weird
the
that way.
state level,
Yeah.
I think it is closer to folks, so you might be able to get away with it maybe through a referendum. The problem is, I
Right.
think state DOTs are losing a lot of their credibility in this space. They have, for my entire life, said, if you just let me build these two extra lanes, we're going to fix
Mhm.
congestion. And we did polling last year, and we polled only about 10% were real, mostly car-free urbanites. Most of them were primarily drivers in suburban and rural areas, and they did not believe that highway expansion would do anything to improve
Right.
their travel.
Yeah.
So that is leading to a break in credibility when, frankly, the local press and the state still tells people, I can solve your congestion, just let me spend $1 billion more adding more lanes.
Right. Let me
So
ask you one last question. It feels like ultimately the idea of a trust fund is that you have this long-term stability. We
Yep.
do infrastructure projects. Infrastructure projects are, by their nature, multi-decade, multi-generational investments.
Yep.
Trust fund is like stability. This seems like we have come to a very unpredictable, unstable situation. Is
Great
this
point.
just like not, to me, this does not work anymore the way that it was originally conceived.
I agree. I don't think we have the stability we believe that we have. And I think, if you look back at what happened at the end of the bill that set up the funding cliff called Safety, we had, I don't know, 12, 13 extensions of some a couple of days, some of 6 months, some a year. That's not stability. And I think we're headed towards that sort of environment. And so the question is there enough instability now that it rips people clear of their preconceptions that this can be easy again, enough to have a real conversation? As we are electrifying vehicles, is that another pressure point that allows us to talk about shaking the system up? I don't think anyone is excited about any new form of tax to replace the gas tax. But again, never let a good crisis go to waste. There's an opportunity here to talk about what the role of the federal government is, what it should be, and the structure of this. And while everyone's terrified of losing the trust fund, again, other countries do it. And if they can do it, we can do it. We will figure it out. No one wants to have to take the time to figure it out, but I have no doubt we're capable of handling that situation. And then the transportation program would have to justify its size annually and prove that it's a good investment, as opposed to waiting just long enough that everyone has forgotten what we talked about during the last reauthorization. And all of the staff people who worked on it have been replaced 3 times over before it comes up again. And then everyone gets fooled into saying, oh, look at all the failures of the program. If we just give them more money for the same things, we'll get a different result. That can only happen with a trust fund. You can't do that with annual appropriations. When Congress and staff have to look at the repeated promises and failures, people will have to come to grips with the fact that whatever we're trying, it's not working. Doesn't matter your intentions, doesn't matter what you're trying. This is dysfunctional and we have to do something different. So will it be rocky? Will it require creativity? Yes, but I have full confidence that this country can do it.
I'm optimistic we will do the right thing after we try all the wrong things,
All
right?
the other all the other
All the
options,
other
yes.
options. Thank you, Churchill, for that insight into the American psyche. Beth Osborne, it's always delightful to talk to you. Always fun
This
and
is
informative.
fun.
People can reach you, follow your work at t4america.org.
That's
And
correct.
if they want to reach you personally, what's the best way to do that?
If you go to our website, my email is right there, as is my phone number, and I do welcome people to reach right on out. I'm always looking for partners and learning more about good ideas at the local and state level. And so, yeah, please not only let me know what you're up to, but let me know what would be helpful to your efforts, because we can design our program and our work to be more supportive of what people are trying to do.
Well, you're doing very important work, and I thank you deeply for taking the time out to chat with us today. Beth Osborne, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fun.
Thanks, everybody, for listening, and keep doing what you can to build a strong town.